Welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be loading the data we scraped from Wikipedia into a Postgres database. Right, so let's get started with that right away. So I'll go back to the browser, then open a new tab and search Postgres Docker. So click on the first results. Right, so let's scroll down and let's look for the Docker Compose definition for Postgres, right? So it's very similar to that of MySQL. So I'll just paste of course, we already have the version and services fields defined, so I'll remove those. Then right here where it says DB, I'll rename this to Postgres DB and create a volume for Postgres DB as well. All right, so you can see the image is pointing to the Postgres image. So this will be downloaded from the Docker container registry. And it also says restart always, and we have environment variable as well, or the settings for environment variables very similar to that of MySQL. So now you can see we have a Postgres password, right? Then we also have a Postgres user and Postgres DB. Right, so let's just paste some values for the Postgres user. Right, let's paste the Postgres DB as well. So for the password, I just use the same thing as what we have for MySQL. Then for the user, just type Amdari user. And for the database, type Amdari DB, right? Then I also have to do volumes mapping, right? So I'm going to map this volume to a path running within the container, right? But let's see what that path is for Postgres. So I'll scroll down, and that path seems to be this value. Right, so I'll map the volume that will be created locally with this file path or folder path within the container. So now let's define some port mapping. So I'll just specify 5435 instead of the default 5432, my local machine, and map that to the 5432 of the Postgres container. So I'll stop this. That's the container running for MySQL. Then when I try to run Docker Compose up this time, it's going to start two containers. That's MySQL DB and PostgreSQL, Postgres DB. And now this is going to start the two containers, right? So we can see it's created a volume for Postgres, that's Postgres DB volume. And now it's initializing the Postgres database, right? So you can see everything we have here is for Postgres. Right, so now we have this message that says Postgres in its process complete, ready for startup. Right, so it's running on port 5432 on the container, but locally we'll be able to access that Postgres database using port 5435, because I already have a Postgres installation running on 5432 locally. Right, so that's why I had to use port 5435 on my system. And of course, that will map to port 5432. Right, so we have both containers running. That's container for MySQL database and also a container for Postgres database. Right, so I'm going to create a new Jupyter notebook file now, and I'll call that postgres-load.ipymb. Right, so it's going to be very similar to what we did for MySQL. So I'll import, so I'll create a new terminal here. right? So what I'll do is install what I need for Postgres, and that's basically the Postgres Python library or driver. And that driver is psycop G2, right? So that should be psycop then G2. So I'll install that. I can see my virtual environment is activated. So that library will be installed in the virtual environment. And while that is installing, I'll import pandas as PD. Then from SQL Alchemy, I'll import create engine. So I'll run that. Of course, I'll select the virtual environment as the kernel. And now I can see that psycop G2 has been installed. So I'll just wait for this to run. So now I'm going to load the universities .csv file. That's the clean, the file that contains the clean data. So that will be universities-clean. Right, so let's see if I can use this extension to connect to the Postgres database, right? So I'm just going to click on the plus button here to add a connection. Right, and this time I'll select PostgreSQL. So it's going to be running on this host. So here, let me just use localhost, right? And the port is 5435, just as we indicated in the Docker Compose file, right? And the username, so let's check that out. The username is Amdari user, which is what we have here. And the password, let's use the Amdari user password, right? So the database I would like to connect to is AmdariDB, or I would just specify an empty value for the database now. Right, and by the way, this says this extension needs to, so basically there's a limit of 3 connections unless, a payment has been done, right? But so that means we are still safe to use this to connect to another database. So I'll click on connect, and it says the database Amdari user does not exist. So I think I'll just have to specify a database name for this Postgres connection. So click on connect, and here we can see connect success, right? So you can see the symbol for Postgres right here. And if I expand that, we can see 2 databases. That's AmdariDB and a default Postgres database, right? We'll be creating our table within this AmdariDB. Right, so now let's just examine this file. I'll type df.add, and we can see our file available right here, right? So I actually didn't change this. So let me see, use Control Z, right? So their actual values, right? So I'm going to just load the data again. And now we can see the original values. So I'll create a new cell. And now that now that we have this new cell, what I'll try to do is here, I'll just import this psycop G2 library, then run that. So create my connection object, just like we did for MySQL. That's psycop G2.connect, right? And you can see it's just, quite similar to what we did using PyMySQL. So I'm going to specify the host, and that's localhost. Then specify a port, which is 5435 in this case. Then a user, which is Amdari user, and the password, and that's Amdari user password. Right, so let's see if we can connect using these credentials. And there seems to be an error. And the error is just regarding the database, right? So we need to specify a database name. And that's Amdari DB. Right? So if I run this, you can see we don't have any error, right? And you can even like start to draw parallels between the way we wrote the connection for MySQL, which is what I have on the right, using PyMySQL, and also what we have done for the PsycObj2 Postgres connection on the left, right? So you see they're actually similar, and in fact, both libraries accept the same connection parameters, right? The same parameters basically. So I'll create a new cell to define the cursor, right? And that's going to be the connection dot cursor. Now run that, we can see that that actually ran successfully, right? So just like I did for the MySQL case, I run cursor dot executes, and let's see if we can show databases, even though I don't think Postgres allows this works. All right, so this isn't allowed in Postgres. But let's run \d. Okay, so yeah, things are a bit different in Postgres regarding the commands we can use, right? But basically, we have the same, connection and cursor objects here, and they work in similar ways, basically. So let's try to create a table within the database, right? So I'm going to create a variable called as create query file. And for that, I'm going to open. So let's try to use the same. And in fact, we can't use the same file because Postgres does not recognize auto increments, right? I believe for Postgres, it's going to be serial, right? But we can actually copy most of the values we have here. So I'll copy this, then create a new file and call that Postgres creates table.sql. So I'll paste what I just copied. And here, so this is going to be serial. And I'll give that primary key, right? So we'll leave all other things except, so I can delete this. And instead of unique key, I just need to type constraints here. So constraints, unique combination, then here type unique, right? So I need the country and the name to be unique. All right, so let's run this. I'm going to specify the file path, that's SQL, then Postgres create table.sql. So the create query, in the case of Postgres, it's, just the same thing we did in the case of MySQL. So here I'll type .read, and let's run that. So let's just see what create query looks like. All right. So now let's execute the query. So if I click on database, so currently, there's no table. Okay, so there's a schema here, but in the public schema, no table available, right? So now, using the cursor, I'll use cursor.execute, then put create query in there and run it. So there seems to be an issue with the way this has been defined. So I'll just remove that. I think that's acceptable in MySQL, but not in Postgres. So I'll just remove the backticks and we'll run that again. Okay. So I'll run this again. All right, then run the cursor.execute again. And okay, another error is there shouldn't be a comma for the last line within the create statement. So run that and then run this. Okay, so what I want to do now is just run connection.rollback. Right, then I'll run this again. And now we see that this actually works, right? But let's see if any table was created. Right, so I'll refresh. Just close this and open again. Maybe refresh the whole instance. And we don't seem to have any table here, right? So in order to actually, see the effects of this query, we need to commit the query we just ran, right? So we need to save it to the database by running con.commit. So that actually commits all the changes. So now if I refresh this, now we see a university table here, right? So very similar to the MySQL case, which we have up here. And it's, in fact, of course, going to be the same columns, right? But this is for Postgres. And currently, we don't have any data here, right? So if I try to, so I'll use SQL Alchemy again, just define the engine variable, create engine. Then this time I'll type Postgres. I believe it's Postgres plus scop g2 : / then a creator parameter, which is going to be an anonymous function, lambda : the connection object. So let's run that. There seems to be an error with that. So it says can't load plugin. I wonder if I add QL here, then run that. Okay, so that actually works. So it should be PostgreSQL plus scop g2, right? So we have the engine here, and I'm going to run pd.read SQL, and I'm just going to run select star from university, right? Since that's the table name. So very similar, right? Very similar to the MySQL case. So now when I run this, we have, an empty table, right? So what we need to do now is exactly the same thing we did in the MySQL video, is that we have a data variable, and that's going to contain, so we use iter tuples, name is none, index is none as well. And we just convert that to a list. Right, so we have our data variable. And now let's just write the merge query or the upsert query for Postgres, right? So I'm going to create a new file for that. So that would be Postgres, Postgres upsert.sql. Right, so it's very similar to that of MySQL, right? But for Postgres, we're going to have this as on conflicts. Right, so this should be on conflict, and I need to specify the the columns that could cause conflicts, right? And those two columns are the country and the name. So I'll remove this since this isn't supported in Postgres, right? So that's going to be country, comma, name. Then we have do updates. then set these values basically. So it's going to be the same values that we set, but instead of having values here, we just have excluded dot founded, right? So I will hold the Alt button, then click on everywhere I need to have a cursor, right? So that I can edit all that at the same time. So I'm going to have excluded dots. Right, so I'll do the same here, hold the Alt down, and just, then for this, I'll just delete the backticks, right? Right, so for Postgres, this is how everything is going to be structured, and it's very similar to that of MySQL, but of course they have different keywords for achieving the same thing, right? So we first start with an insert statement. We still have the placeholders like before, but now we are using on conflicts, and we're trying to see if there's a conflict on this combination, right? Because we've specified these two columns as using unique combination constraints. So when there's a conflict, we're now telling Postgres to update these values basically, right? So I'll bring the Postgres Jupyter notebook back, then create a variable called a merge query file, and that's going to be open SQL, and so that's going to be MySQL of sat. Then the merge query itself is going to be the merge query file.read. Right, so we run that. Let's see what the merge query looks like. So very similar to that of MySQL. Okay, so I'm still reading MySQL of sat. This should be Postgres. This should be Postgres of sat, right? Because I saw this and I know this is for Postgres. So I'll run this again, and let's check that. And yes, this is indeed the query for Postgres. So now I'll run cursor.execute many, supply my merge query, and then supply the data, right? So I'll run that. There seems to be an error here. So an issue with type, right? So backticks, we need to remove the backticks, right? So I'll run that again and see the merge query, no backticks. So I'll run this. Then I need to roll back again, right? Because I ran a query that wasn't successful. So I'll roll back, then run that query again. And we can see that that worked, right? But if I try to print, so I'll just run this line of code. Okay, so we can see some data here. Let's run that again to be sure. All right, so the data isn't available anymore, right? So what we always need to do is, whenever we run a query, right, we should try to commit that query, right? So that the results will be permanently saved to the database. Right, so here I'll just have con.commit, right? Then, so I'll run this again, run execute menu again, and that works. So then commit, right? So now I can run this as many times as I want, and I'll always have the results, right? So now, just like for the case of MySQL, we have been able to load data into the Postgres database, right? So let's see if the updates part actually works for already existing row. So here I would just come here, maybe change. So I'll expand this a bit. So I'll change this again. This time, let's change this to 0 and this to 0, 0, 0, 0. Then maybe let's change the year to 2013 or 2023. And here maybe 2013, right? Okay, so we're going to watch for these two rows. So I can just close these files basically. Okay. So now I just need a line of code to load the data as a pandas data frame. So now I just need a line of code to load the data. That's df equals to pd dot read. So that should be read CSV universities clean dot CSV, right? So I'll run this, then run execute many con.commit then. So we expect this to change to 0 and this to 000, then this to 2013 and this to 2023. So let's run that. And we can see we actually have the changes, right? So in fact, 0000 was changed to just a single 0, right? Which is okay. So you can see that our upstart query actually works. For existing rows, the values that we specify to get updated will actually be updated. And for rows that don't already exist, they will be added to the table, right? So that brings us to the end of this video. I've been able to successfully load the data we scraped from Wikipedia into a Postgres database. So join me in the next video as we see how to achieve this same using SQL Server database, right? So don't go anywhere. See you in the next video.